Great. Let's get started. Well, thank you all for joining us today. My name's Kayla White. I am the board chair of Adirondack Wilderness Advocates. So, just for those of you who don't know who we are, we're dedicated to promoting the knowledge, enjoyment, expansion, and protection of the Adirondack Park's wildest places. We started as a ragtag group of people in 2016 when we got together when discussing Boreas ponds classification and became a group that really just wanted to dedicate ourselves to protecting wild places within the park and advocating for wilderness. And so today, Pete Nelson, one of our board members, is here to talk to you. He represented our interests in the High Peak Strategic Advisory Committee, or HPAG. So that's why he's here to talk to you all about today. He is the co-founder of the Adirondack Diversity Initiative, and he teaches math at NCCC in the Adirondacks. So I'm going to give it over to Pete, but just so you know, if any questions come up, feel free to put your questions in the Q&A or even in the chat function, whatever works for you. I'll be monitoring that, and we'll just save the questions until the end. But thank you all for joining us, and take it away, Pete.
Thank you, Kay. So first of all, thank you all for tuning in. I really appreciate it. It's fun for me to talk about this because it was a very positive experience overall. Why do we need to talk about it more? Well, the report came out, but that doesn't mean that we're going to achieve the ends that the report pointed us towards. And it's too important not to try to do that. And it's a matter for the public. It's the matter for everyone to help bring management of this precious wilderness into a more professional vein, into a broader scope. I think we've seen from the incredible usage spikes and the reaction people had to COVID, how important that is. But it's been important for a long time. And indeed, there are a lot of things that the report came out with that aren't new, but the scope is, and I'll talk about that. So let me load a PowerPoint. I'm not really a PowerPoint guy, but with the week I had, if I don't have some organization, we're all doomed. So let me pull up my screen. And I don't intend to talk for an hour. I intend to go through these slides and then try to answer any questions that you have. So okay. Here are the topics that were advertised, and they are how I've organized this. First, three big themes. There are multiple themes in the report, but three that stand out and they're important. I wanted to bring up media misconceptions because, like every member of the HPAG that I talked to, we were a little dismayed with the media coverage. Media really isn't quotes. It's not just professional media, but it's social media. It's a lot of the conversations ended up arcing into very old kinds of debates, and we meant to get past some of those, or at least point the way. Because I know people are interested, and because it's been in the news, and because there's been a lot of talk about it, I thought I'd briefly talk about the relationship between what we talked about, what we recommended, and the Adirondack Mountain Reserve pilot hiker reservation system. And a few comments on measuring progress. How do we know we're actually doing anything with this? So let me offer some ground rules. I'm going to talk about what went on in the room. I think it's important to talk about that. And I'm going to offer opinions on those things that we talked about, what we agreed they mean, and what we meant by some of the ideas we have. But I'm not really going to offer opinions about what I think is best unless you ask me in questions, and then I'm happy to answer. I'm happy to give my opinion. There's definite overlap. In fact, since we really reached consensus, there's a lot of overlap between what the group said and what I think is good too. But what I think is good too is much less important than what the group said. That leads to the next thing. I'm happy to say I don't know, because you know what? There are a lot of things I don't know. I'm not an expert in wilderness management. That's not my profession. My profession is mathematics, which is a reason for you not to like me already. So, and there are lots of other things. I am not a professional trail crew guy. I know something about trails, but I've never built a trail like of the likes that being done on Cascade or Van Hovenberg, for example. And there's a lot I don't know, and I'm happy to say when I don't. The one thing I won't do is attribute any statements, opinions, or positions to a specific HPAG member. And that's because we all agreed we wouldn't do that. We all agreed we wouldn't do that during the process. And we're really continuing that. It's less important to talk about what an individual person contributed anyhow. And then finally, when you ask questions, I'll answer any question put to me. You may get an I don't know, and you may get a restriction on me attributing it to a specific person. So let's get right into it, because I don't want to take all the time on blathering what I have to say. But there are three big themes that I wanted to talk about in the report. And I wanted to talk about them because I'm not sure that they're always, or they so far have been well understood. One is adaptive management. A second one is a real focus on front country, addressing front country needs, front country resources. And the third one, which really cannot go without passing, is some talk about what collaboration and consensus was like for us and what that points to in the future. So the first one is adaptive management. What the heck is that, right? This term has been thrown about. One of the things that's kind of made me smile is people in various parts of the Adirondack stakeholder story have started to use the words adaptive management, and I've never heard them use the words adaptive management in the past. So it's catching on, but I'm not sure that it's clear what that means. You know, it's kind of jargon, and I'm not a big fan of jargon, but in this case, it's a really good term, and it's a really important part. In fact, it's the central part of our recommendations. So I'd like to talk about it a little bit. First of all, it's related to things that people have talked about. It's related to things that are in unit management plans. It's related to ideas that are decades old and ideas that are still evolving. It's related to things that have been tried elsewhere in the United States, in the Northeast and in the West. And these other things have terms you've probably heard, like carrying capacity, taking, using expert judgment to and input from stakeholders to make a decision about what is the capacity that we want to allow in a certain place, right? And establishing thresholds to match those capacities and monitoring those to see how we're doing. And if those capacities are exceeded, if the thresholds are exceeded, taking management action. So all of that stuff, and that's really a cycle of things, is related to adaptive management. In fact, it's central. The key difference is that what we really tried to engage in the High Peaks Advisory Group was systems thinking. There's a lot of what I'd call siloed thinking in the Adirondacks. I've been involved in park affairs in some detail for only a few years, and some of you tuned in are much more experienced than I am. But I think we all know that there are too many things in the Adirondacks that happen in their own little world and don't necessarily connect to other things. There are decisions that are made by one group that haven't really, included a different group that may be affected. It's complicated, right? And siloed thinking is often a matter of, these are the resources we have, this is the job we got to get done, we're going to go do it, right? Or this is the position that our members or our supporters have. We have to promote that interest regardless of other things, right? So siloed thinking isn't unusual, but we're not going to manage this park well, and we're not going to protect it if we don't engage in what I call systems thinking, and what the HPAG really thought of as systems thinking, which is to understand that all these systems are interrelated. And if we don't take that approach holistically, for easy problems or easy situations, it may not be a big deal, but for really tough situations, of which there are many, we need that kind of scope. That's why, by the way, visitor use management is such a compatible framework. So you've heard this term, it's been in the news, it's in the HPAG, and it is also in the new management guidance that was reviewed by the DEC and APA at the latest APA meeting, released for public review. Visitor use management is a framework, so it in and of itself doesn't specify any of the details of how you might set thresholds or how you might engage stakeholders. But it's such a framework so those kinds of things happen. And it's very much designed to allow the kind of scope that's needed to deal with a problem. Okay, so visitor use management isn't the same thing as adaptive management, but it's the kind of approach or framework that lets us do adaptive management. Now, at this point, your head might be spinning, or it may sound like I'm not talking about anything. So I'm going to give you a specific example. There is a laudable effort that's gone on for a long time now to protect alpine summits, and our own board chair, Kayla, is the summit coordinator, right? It's her program at this point. And it has been an unqualified success. What does that have to do with something that's another part of the HPAG report that may at first not seem very related, which is what shuttle routes should we do? What should the shuttle schedule be? And how should we operate them? Those things are really siloed right now, but they shouldn't be because they're connected. So why? Well, one of the things that's obvious that impacts summits is the number of people on them, right? So this is not an argument for limiting access. I'll leave that argument to lots of other people. This is just an example. But a shuttle thought of as part of a system can act as a throttle. If we set a threshold or if we set some capacity limit for a particular trail, because the number of people on it are going to do damage to a fairly narrow section of trail approaching the summit, or a variety of other factors, the shuttle itself can be a way to throttle the number of visitors. If we don't allow parking at the trailhead, if people have to use shuttles or on-demand services to get there, then we can react in real time. If there is a rush of people, we can throttle up and down. So how we manage shuttles directly impacts how many people might be on that trail. Shuttles are dispersal mechanisms. Once again, I am not arguing for or against dispersal. I have an opinion about it. That's neither here nor there at the moment. But dispersal is sort of a default that the state has and others have thought is maybe a good idea. If there's 400 people want to go to Cascade, let's disperse some of them elsewhere. Well, that is easier said than done. And it's actually a fairly complicated problem. But if you had a shuttle system with multiple stops timed in a way that was useful, you could disperse people. And that obviously has an impact on alpine summits because a variety of trails go to them. How about this? Shuttles make perfect education centers. You have a captive audience in a shuttle. You could, instead of just handing them a flyer, having a half minute at a trailhead or less for somebody who's anxious to hit the trail, you could actually have a more robust and comprehensive set of information that was given to shuttle passengers on leave no trace principles, on rock hopping, on the particulars of a specific trail they're going to and what the summit is like and what they might expect. So shuttles can be education centers. If you really want to deal with the number of people that might swarm a trail that leads to Algonquin or Marcy in the Adirondacks, then you really have to think of the entire system: human, social, biological, ecological, and yes, transportation, because they're all linked. So adaptive management wants to honor those links and think about it, and the visitor use management framework gives us a framework to structure that approach. So obviously, if you think about that kind of linkage, even just with something like shuttles, just one example, we need to understand a lot about people. It's not enough to understand a lot about biology or ecology. We need to understand people's motivations, behaviors, education levels, expectations, all of that. In other words, we need social science. Social science is critical. And when we talk about adaptive management, we are fundamentally talking about social science being a cornerstone of how we successfully engage in system thinking. And it's in scant supply. There are people in the Adirondacks that are doing it. I think of Jill Weiss, I think of Heidi Kretzer, I think of McKaylee Glennon. There are some really smart scientists at work who are trying to measure social factors, but we're only the beginning of that. There's a lot that we don't know, and there's a lot more that we need to know. In adaptive management, there are three critical components that make it work. It's very, very important because these components help get rid of some of the misconceptions that people have about, what this is and why it would or wouldn't work. So first of all, it has to be data driven. And I put in parentheses science driven. And because I could spend the rest of the night talking about this is a pet peeve of mine, and I have a data background, but too many people throw the word data out as though they're accomplishing something. Well, let's go get data, as though data is a talisman. It isn't. It has to be meaningful data. It has to be measurable or statistically significant. It has to have semantic consistency. There's a lot of things that need to be in place for data to be meaningful. So we need science to drive that. We need smart people who know the science in a given domain to help us make sure we're gathering and measuring the right stuff, right? We can't measure what's going on if we don't have the right data. It has to be scalable. We don't need an army of 30 people to figure out what we're going to do if we decide to reopen the trail to Little Porter. We don't need, not every problem in the Adirondacks requires a huge approach. And more than that, even problems that are extremely complicated, like what we do in the Route 73 corridor, for example, we're not going to get the ultimate solution, and we're certainly not going to have the resources and the money to implement some kind of large-scale approach that we don't even know will work. We have to scale. We have to be able to start small. We have to be able to address things that aren't big deals with very quick and simple actions, and we need to be able to scale up, right? And so scalability is critical in all kinds of ways. And then finally, iterative. That is, we don't just do this once, we don't just do it twice. We start on a small scale and we try something. Let's try a couple of shuttle routes, or let's try a different approach to managing this particular trail. Let's try this new education technique. Let's try this new app that provides people information before they come to the trail, and then ask them about what they learned or what they knew before they started and what might have helped. And then let's adapt, let's do better. Okay, we've heard back from people, we can do something different. Okay, we've tried these shuttle routes, nobody's taking them because they don't pick up at convenient times, or there's no service after 7 p.m., whatever, we got to change something. So the whole idea of this approach, and the whole idea is baked into the visitor use management framework too, is that it's iterative. We try something, we build something, we scale and scope it reasonably, and then we do it better. And then we do it again and do it better. So those three components work together. And one of the things they mean is that we don't have to overdo it. This doesn't mean that we have to overdo everything. It means we can be smart. So that answers this question. Is this big thinking? It is, because we want to have a scope that includes all the things that can affect something that we want to protect in the Adirondacks. Is it too big? It is if you get grandiose with it. And there are a couple of people that I've either talked to privately or heard comments that they've made that think that this is just too much. Well, they're right if we overdo it, but we don't have to, because it's scalable. We can be smart. So let's think smart, not necessarily think big. That's really, all of this stuff is what makes adaptive management adaptive management. We're going to manage and we're going to change. We're going to learn. It's driven by data and smart people and asking questions of our visitors, social science. Okay, so the second main theme is that front country resources are essential. There's a lot of front country stuff in the report. So obviously this is clear. We need the infrastructure to handle these visitor surges. Whether you like the term overuse or not, there's no question that on a given day, it's just a ridiculous, the possibly ridiculous amount of people, way more than we have any kind of infrastructure to handle. So We have to work on that. So that's kind of obvious, an obvious example of that is toilets. We don't have enough toilet facilities. Something needs to be done. It's a real problem, right? By the way, here's something fun that I'll come back to you. Of all the varied topics, important topics, and some of them quite beautiful and interesting topics, what topic of discussion took the most time in the room when we were talking through all this? And by the way, we did a lot of talking through this. This was a lot of work. Every 2 weeks we met, people were really committed to the process. I don't have an answer to this question because I didn't have my stopwatch out, but I can tell you that one major candidate is toilets and human waste. I was like way near the top. Permits, ladies and gentlemen, were way near the bottom. I'll get to that. I think that there's a lot of research in this particular area, and there are people on this call, on this webinar, pardon me, that already know this and know it probably better than I do. But the report acknowledges and really pushes the idea that transportation and parking affect everything else. Doesn't mean we should lead with them necessarily, but the impact is undeniable, and we can't make transportation and parking decisions in a vacuum. And that's a real problem. So the report strongly talks about things that ought to be done in the way they ought to be done, so that parking and transportation issues are integrated in a systems way into all these other impacts in the Adirondacks. So linking transportation carrying capacity, recreation carrying capacity, that's an academic area, and there's a lot of promise to it. I talked about shuttles already, but I'll just point out they're adaptive by nature, right? They're totally adaptive by nature. Oh, it's a light day. Okay. We'll retire 4 of them and only run 1. There are places in the country where shuttle needs are highly dependent on a particular day. So jurisdictions will buy school buses, electric school buses, and run them as shuttles when they're needed, right? There's all kinds of ways to adapt. You adapt the route, you adapt the volume, you adapt the number of customers. I think we recognize in the report that we can't have static services. It's fine to have a schedule, but people come out of the high peaks at 11 p.m. and need a ride. So on-demand services have to be part of it. And we have to be careful, and this was championed by several people in the room. We have to really be careful and realize we're not just talking about hikers. We're talking about rock climbers. We're talking about bird watchers. We're talking about people who want to swim at Chapel Pond. We can't forget those people, because that, again, people's behaviors has a direct impact, a systems level impact on what we want to do here. How you design parking, for example, is a hot topic right now with climbers, and it's a hot topic with people who want to swim at Chapel Pond too. So information education, those are proven winners. I don't have to tell anybody on the call that. We know how effective information education is, and there's a strong consensus in the room during the HPAG that we need to lead with information education. We haven't even gotten partway down the road of what we can do if we have good information available to people at the right time. So first of all, we have lessons from the Summer Steward program. That has taught us a lot, and it has taught us how much education and information can affect conditions in the high peaks. That's not just true of the Summit Steward program, by the way. It's true of how bears are treated and how food is stored and how campsites are taken care of, all of which are far better than they were 20 years ago. And believe me, I know. So, but the Summit Steward program is a specific success story. It's brilliant, and this is a backcountry success story. But timing is important. Having people in the backcountry helping you with information you need and helping you understand your behaviors, understand the biology that you're immersed in is great. But it's also important to have people know stuff before they hit the trail. In fact, it's important to have people know stuff before they get to the Adirondacks. So we need to get in front of these information needs. The Summit Steward program is great. It's not enough. So we've talked about trailhead stewards. We talked about shuttles as education. We've talked about hiker information centers, kiosks, those physical kiosks, which are, I think, delightful, and virtual. Let's have apps that are kiosks, basically, with all the information except real time. Those are all things that we talked about. These are all front country things, and they're essential, especially because of the social aspect of all of this. Finally, this is the third main thing. there was a recognition, I think, from everybody in the room, including the DEC. The DEC can't do it alone. The DEC can't do it all. We need lots of people at the table. This is not a new idea at all, right? This is not a new idea in any way. But I have to take my hat off to the DEC, the folks in the room. Whatever might have occurred with various groups in the past, whatever the ups and downs are of trying to share, work, and collaborate, what happened in that room was special. The folks from DEC were so supportive. They let the group run the show. They took our recommendations. There was no steering. There's really no politics in the room, not from DEC folks and not from anybody else for that. There really weren't any arguments. There were debates, but I think it's important for people, for the public to know that this was a really positive experience, and people didn't argue, and people didn't have a lot of, hard differences. And that's so important because the age-old debates between preservationists and the locals and government folks and the state, those are tired, stale arguments. Doesn't mean they don't have substance. Sometimes they do, but they didn't in this room, and that points the way to being able to do better. People had a sense of this. This is something I know about from academic and union work in the past. There's a big difference between having a position, which is very rigid and very specific. I want this trail this way, and having interests. Interests are much more important, and people operated based on interests. And the more that we do that when we talk about management in the park and this systems thinking, the better. But I do have two things that need attention. Now, these are not entirely consensus, so a little bit of my opinion sneaks into this one. First of all, I think there is consensus on this. We recommended an Adirondack advisory group, a permanent group to continue, but we need experts at the table. Not everybody in the room. In fact, most people in the room, the HPAG, weren't experts in the subjects that we need experts in. It has to be science driven. It has to be, we need wilderness managers. We need outdoor recreation managers. We need people who really know the stuff. So it was a fine group. We did great. Let's get people who are even smarter than we were. We need expertise in a permanent group. And there was an incomplete discussion about whether and how the process should be open. It wasn't. Summaries were provided. They didn't have a lot of detail. Here my opinion leaks in. I am a powerful advocate for entirely open everything. Before I was a math teacher, I was in the intelligence world, and this is extremely important. So a little bit of my opinion there, but there needs to be a much better discussion, a longer discussion, and some smart decisions about making this process open. People need to be involved. People need to know what's going on. So a couple of caveats there. Since this is an AWA webinar, I just wanted to very briefly talk a little bit about our own priorities. We have some key values. Kay talked about them, but we're interested in protecting and expanding wilderness, and specifically preserving and increasing remoteness and solitude. Those are watchwords for us. Very, very important for the work that we want to do. In other words, aesthetics matter. And I bring this up not so much to talk about AWA, but to talk about aesthetics, because when you talk about data and science, you talk about biology and ecology, it's possible to forget that wilderness is an aesthetic concept, and it's really important to remember that and to protect it. If aesthetics matter, then human behavior and human values matter, right? So this is really important for us, and it's why we are champions of adaptive management, because if human behavior and human values matter, so that the aesthetic ideas of wilderness are in the forefront, which, by the way, they were. If you read the report, the first guiding principle is the protection of wilderness is paramount. Everybody in the room agreed. There was no argument about, well, we need more access, or maybe we could reclass. None of that, right? It was total support for wilderness protection. And if that's an aesthetic that involves human behavior, then social science and adaptivity necessarily matter. So our priorities are met by the tone of the report. That doesn't mean we agree with everything in the report, and it doesn't mean that we'll agree with every action that's taken as a result. Dispersal is a really good example, and this could again take the entire webinar. but as sort of a default condition. It was addressed lightly in the report. We quite frankly talked about it a lot at the very end of our process and didn't have time to say more. But is dispersal to other trailheads really a good idea? How does that affect remoteness and solitude, much less biology? So we at AWA are keeping our eye on that, and I think that the public needs to as well. Okay, the rest will go pretty quickly, but I do want to cover three things. There are misconceptions in the media, both the reporting media, social media. People immediately put into little containers what they thought the report had. So I want to disabuse folks of a couple of them. One is the conception that we recommended permits. No, we did not recommend permits. Here is the actual language from the report. If you scan the entire report, the word permits appears twice. Well, actually, one is a URL link in an appendix, so 3 times. It has nothing to do with the topic in hand. Another one is parking permits, and suggesting maybe in certain lots a parking permit is a good idea. But the one that people care about is this one. And I'm not going to read. People who read from PowerPoint presentations, every word should be taken offline. But you can read it yourself. This isn't a recommendation for permits. It's a suggestion that permits are one of many ways, one of many tools in a wilderness manager's toolkit that might or might not be appropriate. So let's find out. We didn't recommend permits. We recommended that we learn more, and then maybe in certain cases, limited access is a good idea. We really didn't take a position, if you will. This one, oh, there's the folks that want to preserve the wilderness and we've got to limit access, and there are people who want to not limit access, and we have to worry about the economies of our towns. We didn't have that debate. Mostly, in my experience, and I say this as a member of this group, and the feeling that I got in the group, mostly this isn't a debate. I mean, the details and the difficulties lie elsewhere. So this is kind of a false choice. It's been a narrative in the Adirondacks for a long time, years, decades. And it's important to know that the group did not have that kind of debate. We want to preserve the wilderness, that's paramount. We're not talking about limiting access, we're talking about managing the park intelligently. And then this is something that made me chuckle. There's nothing new in the report, it's all been said before. Well, that's true. Some of it has been said before. But the way that we approached it, the scope that we're interested in, and the systems thinking that we're promoting, that hasn't been talked about the same way. So it's very important to acknowledge the work that's been done in the past, and it's extremely important, obviously, to acknowledge the inspiration of the State Land Master Plan. The details in unit management plans, which many of them talk about carrying capacity, talk about monitoring. They talk about a lot of the things that we talked about. We have all of that bedrock in our report and we refer to it. But we're really talking about taking a step further, especially with the addition of social science into a more of a system thinking approach. That is new. It's not new in the world. People are doing this elsewhere, but in the Adirondacks, we have some work to do to head the right direction. Okay. The relationship between our recommendations and the pilot hiker reservation system with the AMR. I just thought I'd cover this briefly because it's a hot topic right now. So first of all, we didn't create, cause, or recommend that pilot to happen. We had nothing to do with it, but we knew it was coming. This is going the wrong way. It's there. We knew that it was coming. While we were in the room, we were given information from state folks. I think many of us have heard about it anyhow. We were pretty sure that that pilot was going to go into effect. In fact, it would have gone into effect the year before, if not for COVID. So what we decided to do is say, well, this is an example of something we could do that could be a pilot we could learn from. So we use that fact to make a more robust recommendation. Our recommendation is not the AMR pilot. Our recommendation is listed here, and I won't read it to you. Once again, you can read it yourself. But I want you to notice something. What we have here is really a pilot from which we intend that things have to be learned. So we're going to test best practices. We're going to collect the data that we need, baseline data and protocols, so that we can make future management decisions. And we're going to make recommendations. So from our standpoint, whatever kind of pilot is conceived, and there are others, by the way, that may occur, whatever kind of pilot is conceived, it has to be a pilot that's measuring the right stuff, that really is allowing us to learn. So we're interested in that with the Adirondack Mountain Reserve pilot. We want to know what the social science piece is, what the data collection is. Lots of members of the HPAG have talked about that. And I think the public needs to be interested in that. So that's just sort of a review of how we relate to it, which is indirectly. And no, we did not recommend the spikes along Route 73 to keep people from parking. I saw that somewhere, like, well, the HPAG recommended that, so that's why that. No, we did not. So don't send me hate mail on the spikes. Okay, finally, how do we know we're making progress? This is the other slide where my opinion will ooze in a little bit. Because I think there are some specific things that are probably more important than others to signal that we're headed in the right direction. So here they are. The DEC, when Commissioner Segas wrote a letter in response to the release of the High Peaks Advisory Group report, it was a great letter, very supportive. And in the letter, he said that the state is studying the formation of a permanent Adirondack Advisory Group. Great, because it's needed. It needs to have some teeth. It needs to have the kind of influence and free hand that the HPAG had, but it needs more expertise, as I said. So that's great. We need to see that happen. That's really, really important. So that's one thing to look at. Adaptive management was recommended. Let's operationalize it. Where is it actually going to be applied? So pilots. There is a nascent pilot to take a broader look at how to monitor and manage alpine summits. And the state has released its visitor use and wildlands monitoring management guidance. We have to see where that's applied and how that's applied and what can be learned from it. The state needs to show a commitment to social science, needs to be funded and needs to be incorporated into adaptive management projects. Social science isn't just a throwaway. We don't just say, hey, we're doing visitor management because we're asking you a few questions about visitors. We need a robust scientific basis to understand people's behaviors, motives, experience, education, all of that. An increase in education resources, which we've seen with this budget already. This is a good start. We need more stewards. We need more education resources in general. And then the last one is a tough one, but transportation planning needs to be integrated into everything else, better integrated into everything else, so that those decisions aren't made in a vacuum or in a silo. Those are some things that I think would be a way to know that the spirit and most important aspects of the report are being pursued in the right way. And it's an unprecedented opportunity to change and evolve our management of the Adirondack Parks. This is a world-class treasure, as we all know. It needs world-class management and science. Where's the elephant in the room? I'll just mention this briefly. I'm pretty proud of myself. I made it through an entire presentation and didn't bring up trails once. And I'll just say this. Of course, we talk about trails in the report. From my perspective, and a little bit of a mixed perspective in the room, we didn't really talk about it enough. From my perspective, trails are a separate deal. They are an all-in, we've got to take care of these things. They're independent of overuse. They're not independent of the systems thinking by any means, but there obviously needs to be an all-in approach to work on Adirondack trails. So I just thought I mentioned that. With that, I will say thank you. Just some perspectives and things to review what the intent of the report was. I really appreciate your time in listening, and I'm ready to take any questions. I'm happy to see a question. Can you send us the PowerPoint afterwards? Sure, people can have the PowerPoint. It's fine with me. So I can take your questions on chat, or if Kay or Craig have any to forward to me, that would be great.
And just know that we are going to post this on our social media as well, this recording. Okay, so Jack asked, have you had a chance to look at the recent DEC APA visitor use document? If so, how does it compare with the committee's work?
That's a great question, Jack. The answer to the question is, oh, yes. Uh, I was, like many people, was waiting with bated breath for the release of the management guidance, and I pored over it. I think it's a good start. I really do. I think that it has the right kind of framework to begin to approach these adaptive management challenges. Um, and it does acknowledge the visitor and social science piece. And it does, as it should, provide a vehicle for stakeholder involvement. It's a good basis. It isn't complete. And here I will go ahead and take the massive risk, not too great, of quoting Chad Dawson. Chad is on the board of Adirondack Wild, but he is also a technical consultant to Adirondack Wilderness Advocates. And Chad and Dave Gibson and two of us from ADBA have been talking on a regular basis in an informal alliance about how to move some of these things forward. Chad obviously spent 15 years putting together what became that management guidance. And just today, I was talking to Chad, and he made the direct comparison better than I can. Basically, his view and mine as well, without his expertise, is that while it's a good start, it's targeted at more at some specific situations and problems, and doesn't have a broad enough social science component and a broad enough approach to viewing a systems level problem to do everything that we need. That doesn't mean that it can't get there. One of the things that I think is really important is to pilot a variety of things, pilot new approaches on the Alpine summits, pilot new approaches on a couple of places in private land, and use this management guidance actively, measure things and learn from it. I think Chad is optimistic, as am I, that it could grow into a core piece of the adaptive management approach. So good start, not done, not broad enough. That would be my opinion.
Great. And so Brian asked, did HPAC consider the size of the ranger force?
Um, we did. We called for an increase in the size of rangers, assistant forest rangers, summit stewards, trailhead stewards, but specifically rangers. You bet. We added our voice to that call, and I think everybody in the room, that was a no-brainer. There wasn't anybody who's opposed to that. I don't think the state folks in the room were opposed to that. It's a tough lift, but we supported it.
Great. Jack asks, funding seems to be critical for success. Thoughts?
Yeah, it certainly does. Jack knows. Funding is a challenge. I am not privy to the way that the current state budget was approved in April, the way that evolved exactly. But there was the possibility that a significant amount of money was going to be put toward visitor use management, or in my mind, adaptive management in any case. I think that intention is going to be revisited in the next budget. And there are some discretionary funds. And there is, of course, the Bond Act, which has some direct effects on our recommendations and some indirect potential effects on our recommendations. There also was, of course, money to run the shuttle program that's been put on hold because of COVID, because of resource issues. But the long and short of it is that adaptive management itself is not a huge resource lift. That's not a huge funding issue. We don't need to have $15 million to make that work, partly because it is an iterative and scalable thing. But I think, Jack, that the hardest part is I'm not sure there's a recognition at all levels of the legislature and state government that we've got to fund the science, that we've got to fund people doing the science, or the bedrock that we need for this isn't going to be there. There is also a lot of infrastructure, but I think the infrastructure it's going to be a mixed bag. We'll benefit from the World University Games as Orta already has greatly. I think the future of the shuttle program and what that could be is very bright, especially with the impetus to deal with climate change. I think it's the stuff that isn't necessarily on people's radar, not as easy to quantify, like the science and like the education resources that are going to be tougher.
Great. So Mark asked, we went hiking Refugio to Refugio in the Dolomites 8 years ago, and it was doable because public transportation was accessible and scheduled from town to town and trailhead to trailhead. How fungible or transformable is the existing system in the high peaks towards the goal of limiting parking and of controlling visitors?
That's a great question. So I'm going to take off my HPAG guy in the room hat a little bit, because this is something that I've been working on, transportation in the park. So how fungible or transformable is the existing system in the high peaks? That depends on how you look at it. There really isn't an existing system in the high peaks. There are a couple of shuttles. The town of Keene has its own. There is bus service in counties. And then there are parking lots and lots of people driving around. People have not thought about the transportation system as a system, but I think that the opportunity is huge. And there was a lot of talk about it in the room, and a lot of the folks who actually live with the parking problems, like in the town of Keene in Essex County, they get it. They understand how important it is to think of a transportation system holistically. But it's not that, especially with the revolution in electric technology, which I am a huge fan of. I've got 2 electric cars myself. The possibilities for an adaptive system that would be smart and be able to move people around is great. I envision a shuttle system where you'd have a schedule on an app. So okay, what's available, right? The shuttles would be every 20 minutes or whatever. There'd be multiple starting and stopping points so that no one would have to sit too long before they got to their trailhead. There would be on-demand services. Well, that's not good enough for me, so I will pay X to get a direct pickup from like an Uber or Lyft, and ultimately, before too long, just a car that's driving itself. That's not that far off, ladies and gentlemen. But at any rate, an on-demand service, so if somebody wants to do better than that, they can. There can be accommodations for people who just want to have sightseeing. So we don't take every parking space, every possible turnaround space, and turn it over to people who are parking to hike. The transportation system includes accommodations for people who just want to get out of the car and look or take a swim. Climbers who can get their gear close to something, that can be part of the system. The change, there's really a revolution in transportation that's happening in this country, and it's only going to accelerate. That electric stuff is at the heart of it. Distributed, not very expensive, totally scalable. We can do that in this park, and we can change transportation. And one more thing about that, if we do it, we also benefit people who live here who have terrible transportation options. If you don't have a car in the Adirondacks, you're in a lot of trouble, right? If your job depends, you want to get a job in Saranac Lake and you live in Keene, good luck, right? So the same transportation system can be adapted to and should be designed in the first place to deal with people who live here as well. It's totally doable. The revolution in transportation is ripe for somebody doing something with it in the park. I'd be less optimistic about it happening if it weren't for the incredible amount of money the governor has put toward climate change. There's a lot of money that's going to be made available for this stuff, and I look forward to a huge improvement.
Great. I think that's all the questions we have. Does anyone else have any questions? Going once, going twice. Okay. Oh, thank you guys
Thanks,
so
Jack.
much.
Thank you all. I really appreciate it.
Yes, and feel free to email us, contact at AdirondackWilderness.org if you have any feedback about this presentation, or just have something to say, or check us out on social media. We're always happy to get our supporters' feedback. So thank you all
Yes,
so
and
much.
I should say that there will be more of these. AWA is going to commit to webinars. We think education is really, really important. Dialogue is important. So you'll see more.
All right. Have a great night. Thanks, Pete.
Thank you all.